In the high-stakes world of political journalism, respect is earned, not given. When seasoned reporter Melanie Mitchell attempted to corner and humiliate Usha Vance during what should have been a routine interview, she had no idea who she was really dealing with. The exchange that followed would become a masterclass in composure, intelligence, and quiet strength that left viewers stunned. Comment where you're watching from today as we explore how one prepared mind triumphed over calculated disrespect. The sleek studio of National Capital News sparkled under professional lighting, cameras positioned strategically to capture every reaction, every micro-expression. The air conditioning hummed quietly, keeping the atmosphere cool despite the heat generated by the intense lighting grid overhead. Outside the glass walls, producers and assistants hurried about, checking schedules and preparing for upcoming segments. This wasn't just any news day, it was the height of campaign season, when every interview could potentially shift polling numbers and public perception. Usha Vance sat poised in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Unlike many political spouses who seemed uncomfortable in the spotlight, she carried herself with natural dignity. Her education at Yale Law School and experience as a successful attorney had prepared her for high-pressure situations, though she typically preferred to maintain a lower profile than today's appearance would allow. Her simple yet elegant attire, a tailored navy dress with minimal jewelry, reflected her preference for substance over spectacle. The studio crew moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting microphones and checking audio levels. A makeup artist made a final touch-up, then stepped away with a respectful nod. Usha smiled briefly in thanks, then returned her attention to reviewing mental notes on the topic she expected to discuss: education reform, legal aid for underserved communities, family policy initiatives, the standard areas where political spouses were expected to demonstrate interest and expertise. What she didn't know was that Melanie Mitchell had prepared a very different kind of interview. Melanie strode into the studio with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling the narrative. At 42, she had built her reputation on what she called journalistic fearlessness, what others might term aggressive confrontation. Her tailored red blazer was a power statement, her dark hair styled to perfection. She was known for making politicians squirm, for asking the questions other journalists avoided. Her ratings were excellent, her methods were controversial, and today she had identified Usha Vance as her target. 3 minutes to air, called out the floor director Kevin Smith, as technicians made final adjustments to the lighting. Melanie settled into her chair across from Usha, placing her tablet on the small table between them. She didn't she didn't offer the customary pre-interview pleasantries. Instead, she studied her guest with calculating eyes. "Mrs. Vance," she finally said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "Thank you for joining us today. I hope you're prepared for an honest conversation." There was something in her tone, a subtle hint of challenge, that made several crew members exchange glances. Michelle Walker, the production assistant, frowned slightly. She'd worked with Melanie long enough to recognize the signs of an ambush. "Interview in the making. I always appreciate honest conversation, Ms. Mitchell," Usha replied evenly, her slight smile unwavering. "I believe it's essential to meaningful public discourse." Melanie's lips curved upward, though the expression didn't. "Reach her eyes. Excellent, then we should get along just fine." 30 seconds, announced Kevin, signaling to the camera operators. The red light on camera 1 illuminated, and Melanie's demeanor transformed. Her smile widened, professional and camera-ready. "Good afternoon, and welcome to Direct Questions. I'm Melanie Mitchell, and today we're joined by Usha Vance, wife of senatorial candidate J.D. Vance. Mrs. Vance, thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," Usha responded, with the practiced ease of someone who understood the rhythms of media appearances despite not seeking them out. You've largely stayed out of the spotlight during your husband's campaign, Melanie began, her tone deceptively conversational. Some might say unusually so for a political spouse. Is there a reason you've been keeping such a low profile? It was a loaded opening question, implying reluctance, perhaps even suggesting discord, but Usha didn't flinch. I wouldn't characterize it as unusual, Melanie. I'm a practicing attorney with active cases and commitments to my clients. Like many professional women, I'm balancing multiple responsibilities. But I'm fully supportive of my husband's campaign and participate when and where it makes sense for our family. Melanie nodded, her expression revealing nothing. Speaking of your legal career, you've worked at some prestigious firms. Some critics have suggested that your husband's political connections have opened doors for you professionally. How do you respond to that? The implication was clear, and in the control room, producer Gabriel Daniels winced. This wasn't the agreed-upon direction for the interview. Through his headset, he considered instructing Melanie to return to the approved question list, but he knew from experience that she would likely ignore him. Once Melanie started down a path, she rarely deviated. In the studio, Usha's expression remained composed, though something flickered briefly in her eyes. Not anger or offense, but perhaps recognition of the game being played. I earned my law degree from Yale before my husband entered politics, she answered calmly. My professional accomplishments stand on their own merits. Anyone familiar with my work history would know that I've built my career through the same means as any other attorney: education, hard work, and commitment to serving my clients effectively. Yet you've benefited from your husband's growing profile, haven't you? Melanie pressed, leaning forward slightly. Your husband's controversial positions have certainly raised your visibility. I'd challenge the premise of your question, Usha replied, her voice still measured. My husband and I are separate individuals with our own professional identities. If you'd like to discuss the substance of my legal work or my community initiatives, I'm happy to do so. Melanie's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger, reactions that would make for compelling television. Instead, she was meeting composed rationality. She decided to escalate. Let's talk about your background then. You're the daughter of Indian immigrants. Your husband has taken strong positions on immigration. Some would say restrictive positions. Does that create tension in your household? Do your parents approve of his stance? In the control room, Gabriel spoke urgently into his microphone. Melanie returned to the approved questions. This isn't what we discussed. She touched her earpiece briefly in acknowledgement, but continued her current line of questioning. Usha took a moment before responding, her posture still relaxed, but her eyes now directly meeting Melanie's with quiet intensity. My parents came to this country legally and worked hard to build their lives here. They instilled those values in me: respect for the law, dedication to education, and commitment to contributing positively to society. My husband shares those values. We believe in legal immigration and creating pathways for people to succeed. In America, there's no contradiction there. Melanie wasn't satisfied, but specifically on his calls for stricter border control and reduced immigration numbers. My husband believes in secure borders and an immigration system that works efficiently and fairly, Usha interjected smoothly. These aren't radical positions. They're positions held by many Americans across the political spectrum who want a functional system that serves our national interests while treating people with dignity. If you'd like to discuss the nuances of immigration policy, I'm happy to do so, but I think it's important to move beyond simplistic characterizations. The camera operator, Daniel Russell, tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but he couldn't help being impressed. Most interview subjects would be flustered by now, defensive or angry. Usha Vance was neither. She was responding with the precision of the attorney she was, neither avoiding questions nor allowing herself to be mischaracterized. Melanie sensed her approach wasn't yielding the reactions she wanted. She decided to shift tactics. Your husband has made several statements that critics have called divisive or insensitive. As a woman of color, how do you reconcile supporting rhetoric that many find problematic? The loaded nature of the question hung in the air. In the control room, Gabriel spoke more forcefully into his headset. Melanie, that's enough. Return to the approved questions now. Once again, she ignored him. Usha took a deep breath, and for the first time, there was a hint of something besides pleasant professionalism in her expression, a flash of determination in her eyes. I think it's important to be specific rather than dealing in vague characterizations, Melanie. Which statements are you referring to? In what context were they made? What was the full substance of what was said? Without that specificity, we're not having a meaningful conversation. We're just trading in innuendos. The quiet challenge was clear. Melanie hadn't expected to be put on the defensive, to have her journalistic methods questioned so directly yet calmly. There have been multiple instances, Melanie countered, though her usual confidence wavered slightly. Comments about urban communities, about cultural issues. Again, I'd need specifics to address your question properly, Usha replied. But what I can tell you is that I wouldn't support anyone, husband or otherwise, whose values didn't align with treating all people with dignity and respect. I've dedicated my legal career to helping people access justice, regardless of their background. My husband and I share core values of wanting to create opportunity for all Americans while addressing real challenges facing communities across this country. The dynamic in the studio had shifted subtly but unmistakably. What had begun as an attempted ambush was transforming into a masterclass in poise under pressure. The camera operators exchanged impressed glances. Even some of the production staff, who had initially seemed uncomfortable with Melanie's approach, were now watching with growing admiration for the guests' composure. Melanie, sensing the shift, decided to escalate further. Some have suggested that your marriage represents a kind of political convenience, that your background provides useful diversity to your husband's image. How do you respond to critics who see your relationship in those terms? A collective intake of breath was audible among the crew. Michelle Walker actually closed her eyes briefly, appalled by the question's crudeness. In the control room, Gabriel was now standing, speaking urgently into his microphone. Melanie, this is completely inappropriate. Move on immediately. For a moment, just a moment, something flashed across Usha's face. Not embarrassment or offense, but a brief, crystalline clarity, as though she was seeing through Melanie completely. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, but somehow more powerful for it. Melanie, I've answered your questions respectfully, even when they've strayed from substantive policy discussions into personal insinuations. But I think we've reached a point where I need to note that this interview seems designed not to inform your viewers, but to provoke a reaction that might make for compelling television. She paused, her gaze steady. My marriage is a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and love. Like many marriages across this country, it's not a political strategy. It's not a demographic calculation. It's a relationship between two people who care deeply about each other and about making this country better for all Americans, including our children. The studio had gone completely silent. Even the normally bustling production staff had stilled, watching the exchange. With rapt attention, camera 2, operated by Brett Perry, zoomed in slightly on Melanie's face, capturing her momentary uncertainty as she realized her usual tactics had failed to produce the desired effect. We have a responsibility as public figures, both in politics and in media, to elevate the discourse, not degrade it, Usha continued, her voice still measured. Your viewers deserve better than attempted gotcha moments or questions based on offensive stereotypes. They deserve substance, information, thoughtful discussion of issues that affect their daily lives. The atmosphere in the studio had transformed. What had begun as Melanie Mitchell's attempt to unsettle and provoke Usha Vance had evolved into something entirely different. The production team, initially anticipating the familiar pattern of Melanie's aggressive interviewing style yielding flustered responses, now watched with growing fascination as power dynamics shifted before their eyes. In the control room, Gabriel Daniels removed his headset and placed it on the console, recognizing that his directions were being ignored. He exchanged glances with assistant producer April Martin, both silently acknowledging that this interview had taken an unexpected turn. Whatever happened next would unfold without their intervention. "Mrs. Vance," Melanie said, recalibrating. Her approach, with the practiced adaptability of a veteran journalist, "You speak about elevating discourse, but surely you recognize that tough questions are a necessary part of the political process. Voters have a right to know who they're electing, and that includes understanding the people closest to candidates." Usha nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding the framing. "I completely agree that substantive questioning is essential to the democratic process. The operative word being substantive. Questions that probe policy positions, track records, plans for addressing real challenges. These serve voters. Questions designed to insinuate or provoke without informational value don't serve your viewers. They merely entertain at the expense of civic understanding." Melanie's expression tightened. This wasn't the first time a guest had pushed back against her methods, but rarely with such precision and calm authority. She was accustomed to politicians becoming defensive, angry, or evasive, reactions that only reinforced the narrative she typically constructed. "Some would say you're attempting to control this interview by critiquing my questions rather than answering them," she countered, attempting to re-establish dominance in the exchange. "I've answered every question you've asked," Usha replied evenly. "I've simply also noted when those questions contain unfounded premises or insinuations. That's not controlling the interview. It's engaging with it honestly." She smiled slightly. "But I'm happy to move forward. What substantive issues would you like to discuss?" The directness of the question momentarily left Melanie without a prepared response. In the brief silence that followed, camera operator Daniel Russell suppressed a smile. Michelle Walker, watching from her position near the production desk, felt a surge of unexpected admiration. Even Kevin Smith, the floor director who prided himself on professional neutrality, raised an eyebrow in quiet appreciation. Melanie glanced down at her tablet, ostensibly reviewing her notes, but actually taking a moment to recalibrate. When she looked up, there was a new calculation in her eyes. "Let's discuss education policy then. Your husband has made several controversial statements about the American education system. He's questioned the value of certain university degrees and suggested redirecting emphasis toward vocational training. As someone with an elite law degree from Yale, do you share his apparent skepticism about higher education?" It was a pivot, but still contained a deliberate mischaracterization, a trap designed to force Usha to either contradict her husband or defend a position that Melanie had intentionally oversimplified. "That's a misrepresentation of my husband's position," Usha responded, her tone still conversational rather than confrontational. "He's never expressed skepticism about higher education itself. What he's advocated is recognizing that traditional four-year college degrees aren't the only valuable educational path. Many Americans would be better served by having multiple pathways to success, including technical education, apprenticeships, and yes, traditional universities." She leaned forward slightly, her passion for the subject evident. This isn't controversial. When you look at the data, we have millions of unfilled skilled jobs while simultaneously having college graduates struggling with debt and underemployment. A more diverse educational approach isn't anti-intellectual. It's pragmatic and respectful of different aptitudes and interests. Yet you chose the elite university path yourself, Melanie pressed. I did, because it aligned with my specific career goals, Usha agreed readily, and it was the right choice for me. The point isn't that elite education is bad, it's that it's not the only legitimate path to a successful, meaningful career. A one-size-fits-all approach serves neither individuals nor our economy well. Melanie sensed an opportunity to regain control of the narrative. Some critics would suggest there's a certain elitism in successful professionals like yourself, advocating vocational paths for others while having benefited from prestigious institutions yourselves. Usha's expression remained thoughtful, but a new firmness entered her voice. That perspective assumes that advocating for multiple educational paths somehow devalues certain options. I reject that entirely. Recognizing the dignity and value of all forms of education and work isn't elitist, quite the opposite. The true elitism lies in suggesting that only traditional academic paths deserve respect and investment. She continued, "My father was an engineer. My mother was a chemistry teacher. They taught me that all honest work deserves respect and that different types of intelligence and skill are all valuable. That's a deeply American value that transcends political divisions." In the control room, Gabriel had stopped trying to redirect the interview and was now simply watching with growing interest. This wasn't the contentious exchange he had anticipated, but it was undeniably compelling television, a thoughtful discussion emerging from what had been designed as a confrontational segment. Melanie, recognizing that her usual tactics weren't yielding the desired results, decided to shift to another potentially divisive topic. Your husband has made faith a central element of his campaign messaging, speaking frequently about Christian values. As someone from a different cultural background, has this emphasis created any personal tensions for you? The question contained several loaded assumptions, and several crew members tensed, anticipating conflict. But Usha merely smiled, the expression reaching her eyes. "You know, Melanie, questions like that reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of both faith and marriage. My husband and I share core values, honesty, compassion, service, family dedication that transcend any particular religious tradition. These aren't just Christian values. They're human values found across cultural and religious backgrounds," she continued, her voice warm but firm. "The assumption that people from different backgrounds must be in tension with each other, that diversity within families must create conflict rather than strength, is exactly the kind of divisive framing that impoverishes our national conversation." Michelle Walker, watching from her position by the production desk, found herself nodding, unconsciously in agreement. Brett Perry, behind camera 2, adjusted his framing to capture both women clearly, sensing that this exchange was becoming something unexpected, something worth documenting carefully. Melanie's expression had become difficult to read. She was too experienced to show frustration openly, but the tight control around her mouth suggested she wasn't accustomed to having her questioning approach so systematically dismantled. "You speak about divisive framing," she said, attempting to regain initiative. "Yet many would argue that your husband's campaign has contributed to political polarization through rhetoric that—" "If we're going to discuss polarization," Usha interjected gently but firmly, "perhaps we should examine the media's role as well. When interviews are structured around creating conflict rather than understanding, when complex positions are reduced to provocative sound bites, when the goal becomes generating viral moments rather than informing viewers, that contributes Significantly to our polarized environment, the studio fell completely silent. In the control room, Gabriel Daniels stood motionless, recognizing he was witnessing something rare in contemporary political media, an authentic moment of truth-telling that transcended the usual performative exchanges. Melanie Mitchell found herself in unfamiliar territory. Her carefully constructed persona, the fearless journalist who held power accountable, was being subtly but effectively challenged, not through anger or defensiveness, but through a calm insistence on substance and fairness that was difficult to counter without appearing unreasonable. "Are you suggesting that journalists shouldn't ask challenging questions?" she asked, attempting to reframe Usha's critique as an attack on press freedom. "Not at all," Usha replied, her expression earnest. "Challenging questions are essential to a functioning democracy. What I'm suggesting is that there's a difference between challenging questions designed to elicit information and understanding, and questions designed primarily to provoke or insinuate. The former serves viewers, the latter serves ratings." Daniel Russell, behind camera one, had to suppress a smile. In his 15 years of filming political interviews, he had rarely seen someone so effectively turn the tables without appearing defensive or aggressive themselves. Kevin Smith, watching the time indicators, signaled that they were approaching the scheduled commercial break. Melanie nodded slightly in acknowledgement, relieved at the opportunity to reset. "We'll be right back with more from Usha Vance after this short break," she said, turning toward camera one with her professional smile firmly back in place. As the red lights on the cameras turned off, indicating they were no longer broadcasting, an awkward silence filled the studio. The usual bustle of activity during a commercial break seemed muted, as though the crew were waiting to see what would happen next between the two women. When the red lights flickered back on, signaling their return from commercial break, there was a subtle but discernible shift in Melanie Mitchell's demeanor. During the brief intermission, she had huddled with Gabriel Daniels, who had finally emerged from the control room to speak with her directly. Their whispered conversation had been intense, but brief, ending with Melanie nodding curtly before returning to her seat across from Usha Vance. "Welcome back to Direct Questions," Melanie began, her voice recalibrated to a more measured tone. "We're continuing our conversation with Usha Vance. Mrs. Vance, before the break, we were discussing media's role in political discourse. I'd like to shift to some of the policy initiatives you've personally been involved with, particularly your work on legal aid for underserved communities." The pivot was abrupt but strategic, a retreat to safer, more conventional interview territory. Usha's expression registered subtle surprise, but she nodded and leaned forward slightly, clearly more animated by this substantive topic. "Thank you for bringing that up," she replied. "Access to justice shouldn't be a luxury good in America. When people can't afford legal representation, we end up with a two-tiered system that undermines the foundational principle that all are equal before the law." For the next several minutes, the interview flowed with a different energy. Usha spoke passionately about her pro bono work, about innovative community-based legal clinics, about the need for structural reforms to make the justice system more accessible. Melanie, to her credit, asked thoughtful follow-up questions that allowed for meaningful elaboration. In the control room, Gabriel exchanged glances with April Martin. "This is actually good," he murmured, sounding almost surprised. April nodded, equally impressed by the substantive exchange unfolding on their monitors. "You mentioned structural reforms," Melanie said, referencing her notes for the first time since the interview began. "Could you elaborate on specific changes you believe would have the most impact?" "Absolutely," Usha responded, her expertise evident. "First, we need to adequately fund public defender offices across the country. Current caseloads are often so overwhelming that meaningful representation becomes nearly impossible. Second, we should expand court fee waivers and sliding scale systems to ensure that financial barriers don't prevent people from accessing courts. Third, we need to simplify legal procedures for common civil matters, housing issues, family law, consumer disputes, so that navigating the system doesn't require specialized knowledge or expensive assistance. She continued with passion but precision, outlining a vision of a more accessible legal system that transcended traditional political divisions. Several production staff members who had initially been distracted with technical tasks found themselves listening attentively. These aren't partisan issues, Usha concluded. Whether you're a conservative who believes in equal application of the law or a progressive concerned with systemic inequities, a functioning justice system that serves all Americans should be a shared priority. Melanie nodded, appearing genuinely engaged. Your background gives you a unique perspective on these issues. How has your experience as both a corporate attorney and someone who's worked with underserved communities shaped your approach? That's an excellent question, Usha replied, her appreciation for the substantive inquiry evident. Having worked on both sides has shown me that the gap isn't just about resources, it's about information, accessibility, and design. Our legal system was primarily built by and for people with education, money, and connections. Bridging that gap requires us to fundamentally rethink who the system serves and how it operates. Michelle Walker, watching from her position near the production desk, found herself deeply absorbed in the conversation. This was the interview she had expected when the segment was first planned. Thoughtful, informative, illuminating, before Melanie had decided to pursue a more confrontational approach. For several more minutes, the exchange continued productively, with Melanie asking increasingly thoughtful questions and Usha providing nuanced, informative responses. The studio atmosphere had transformed completely from the tense beginning. Then, perhaps feeling that the interview had become too collaborative, too lacking in the tension that drove ratings, Melanie pivoted again. Your passion for these issues is evident, she said, her tone shifting subtly. Yet some critics have suggested that your advocacy work serves primarily as image management for your husband's campaign, rather than reflecting genuine commitment. How do you respond to that characterization? The abrupt return to insinuation was jarring after the substantive exchange they'd been having. Several crew members visibly tensed. In the control room, Gabriel sighed audibly, shaking his head in frustration. Usha paused, studying Melanie with an expression that wasn't angry, but reflected a certain disappointment. When she spoke, her voice remained measured, but carried a new weight. You know, Melanie, I've been doing this work since long before my husband considered running for office. My legal career and my advocacy aren't political strategies. They're expressions of my values and my professional commitments. The suggestion that women in public life are merely extensions of their husbands' ambitions rather than individuals with their own agency and integrity is, frankly, an outdated perspective I'm surprised to hear in 2025. The response hung in the air, its truth undeniable without being accusatory. Melanie hadn't expected to feel chastened, but she found herself in the unfamiliar position of appearing to be the less progressive voice in the exchange. I'm simply raising questions that some have asked, she countered, attempting to distance herself from the implication. And I appreciate the opportunity to address them, Usha replied evenly. But I think it's worth examining why certain questions persist about women in public life that rarely apply to men. My husband is never asked if his career choices are genuine or merely strategic. His commitments are taken at face value. I would hope we could extend the same presumption of authenticity to all public figures, regardless of gender. Behind camera 2, Brett Perry found himself nodding in agreement. Even Kevin Smith, the floor director who prided himself on professional neutrality, seemed impressed by the response. Melanie recognized that she was losing control of the narrative. Again, but her usual tactics seemed ineffective against Usha's composed authenticity. She decided to try yet another approach. "Let's talk about the campaign directly," she said, consulting her tablet. "Recent polling shows your husband trailing in several key demographics, particularly among women voters and in urban areas. Do you see your role as helping to bridge those gaps?" "I see my role as being true to who I am and the values we share," Usha answered simply. Political campaigns shouldn't be about crafting personas to appeal to different groups. They should be about authentic engagement with voters' real concerns, she continued. The issues facing Americans don't neatly divide along demographic lines. Economic opportunity, educational access, healthcare affordability, these affect everyone, though, sometimes in different ways. My husband's campaign focuses on addressing these substantive challenges rather than demographic calculations. Yet campaign strategy inevitably involves targeting specific voter groups, Melanie pressed. Effective communication certainly requires understanding your audience, Usha acknowledged. But there's a difference between tailoring your message to ensure it's understood and changing your fundamental positions based on who's listening. Integrity requires consistency, speaking the same truth to all audiences, even if you express it in ways that resonate with their specific experiences. Daniel Russell, operating camera 1, was so engaged in the exchange that he nearly missed a cue from Kevin to adjust his framing. The conversation had transcended the usual political interview format to become something more substantive, a genuine exchange of ideas rather than performative confrontation. Let's return to a point you made earlier about media's role in political discourse, Melanie said, attempting once more to regain the upper hand. Would you say you're critical of journalism that asks tough questions of political figures? Not at all, Usha replied with a small smile. I'm critical of approaches that conflate tough with gotcha, or that prioritize conflict over clarity. The toughest questions are often the most straightforward. What specifically will you do to address this problem? How will you implement this policy? What evidence supports your position? These questions require substantive answers that inform voters. She leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. Journalism at its best holds power accountable through persistent pursuit of truth, not through manufacturing controversy. The journalists I most respect are those who do the difficult work of making complex issues accessible without oversimplifying them, who inform rather than inflame. In the control room, Gabriel checked the real-time audience metrics on his monitor and was surprised by what he saw. Viewership had actually increased during the interview, with social media engagement spiking in the last few minutes. The audience wasn't tuning out the substantive discussion. They were increasingly engaged by it. We're nearly out of time, Melanie said, glancing at the clock. One final question. What do you believe is the greatest misconception about you in the public sphere? It was a standard closing question for political interviews, designed to allow the subject a final moment of image management. But Usha's response proved anything but standard. I'm not particularly concerned with misconceptions about me personally, she said thoughtfully. What concerns me more are the misconceptions that divide us as Americans. The idea that we must be enemies because we have different perspectives, that compromise is weakness, that compassion is naivety. Her voice grew more passionate, though still measured. We're facing real challenges as a nation, challenges that require us to see beyond political tribes to our shared humanity. My hope isn't that voters come away with a better understanding of Usha Vance. It's that we all come away with a better understanding of each other and a renewed commitment to the difficult work of democracy. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Even Melanie, despite herself, seemed moved by the response. "Mrs. Vance, thank you for joining us today," she said, her professional smile returning, but now tinged with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Thank you for the conversation, Melanie," Usha replied with equal professionalism as the camera's red lights blinked off, signaling the end of the broadcast. An unusual thing happened. Instead of the typical immediate dispersion of the crew to their next tasks, there was a moment of collective pause, a silent acknowledgement that they had witnessed something uncommon in contemporary political media. An exchange that had begun as attempted humiliation, but transformed into authentic dialogue. In the sudden quiet of the studio, Melanie Mitchell found herself experiencing an unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't quite embarrassment, nor was it anger at having her usual tactics neutralized. It was closer to something she hadn't felt in years of broadcasting, a whisper of self-reflection. The aftermath of the interview unfolded with unexpected ripples across the media landscape. As the studio crew began dismantling equipment and preparing for the next segment, a curious energy lingered in the air. Typically, the conclusion of a political interview was marked by a swift return to routine, equipment checks, schedule confirmations, preparation for the next broadcast. But today, conversations buzzed among the production staff, voices low but animated. "In 15 years of production work, I've never seen anything quite like that," Michelle Walker murmured to Brett Perry as they reviewed footage at the monitoring station. Brett nodded, replaying a particularly powerful exchange. She completely reframed the entire conversation without ever raising her voice or seeming defensive. That's rare. In her dressing room, Melanie Mitchell sat alone, reviewing notes for her next segment. But her usual laser focus was disrupted by persistent thoughts about the interview that had just concluded. She prided herself on being unflappable, on maintaining control regardless of her subject's responses, yet something about the exchange with Usha Vance had left her feeling oddly unsettled. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Gabriel. Daniels entered without waiting for a response, his expression a complex mixture of professional concern and reluctant admiration. "Early numbers are in," he said without preamble, placing a tablet on the desk in front of her. "Social media engagement is through the roof. Done as direct questions is trending nationally." Melanie glanced at the screen, expecting to see the usual pattern after her confrontational interviews. Polarized reactions split along predictable partisan lines. Instead, she found something more nuanced and, frankly, surprising. These responses. She began scrolling through the analytics. "I know," Gabriel replied. "It's not what we expected. People across the political spectrum are engaging with the substance of what she said. The clips are being shared by conservatives and progressives alike." Melanie continued scanning the data, her professional instincts temporarily overriding her personal discomfort. "And the segment on legal aid reform is getting the most traction, not the more confrontational exchanges." Gabriel nodded. "By a significant margin. It's the policy discussion that's resonating, not the attempts at gotcha moments." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "The audience seems hungry for substance, for actual conversation rather than performed conflict." Meanwhile, in another room down the corridor, Usha Vance gathered her belongings, preparing to depart. She moved with the same composed efficiency she had displayed throughout the interview, betraying no signs of stress or triumph. As she slipped her notes into her briefcase, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Hello?" she answered, her voice warm. "Just watched the interview," came her husband's voice. "You were remarkable." "Thank you," she replied simply. "I just tried to redirect towards substance whenever possible." "You did more than that," he said, pride evident in his tone. "You modeled a different way of engaging, exactly what we've been talking about. How are you feeling?" "Fine," she said, and meant it. It wasn't personal. Ms. Mitchell was doing what the current media environment rewards. I just refused to play by those rules. As this conversation unfolded, activity in the studio continued. Kevin Smith, reviewing the broadcast schedule with April Martin, paused as his phone chimed with a notification. Headquarters is already requesting the full, unedited footage, he said, showing April the message. That's unusual. They typically only want the final broadcast version. April read the message, her eyebrows rising. Priority request directly from the network president? That never happens. Across town, in the downtown offices of a rival news network, senior producer Heather Fisher was holding an impromptu meeting with her team. On the large screen dominating the conference room wall, they watched selected clips from the Mitchell-Vance interview, which had already been uploaded to various social media platforms. This is generating exceptional engagement metrics, she observed, gesturing toward the data displayed on her tablet. Not just views, but substantive comments, extended watch time, cross-demographic sharing. It's because it's so different from the usual political theater, said Ryan Jenkins, the network's political director. Viewers are starved for exchanges that don't feel scripted or performative. The question, Heather continued, is whether this represents an anomaly or a potential shift in audience preferences. Are people genuinely interested in more substantive political coverage, or is this simply the novelty factor? Back at National Capital News, Melanie Mitchell had left her dressing room and was now standing in the doorway of the main studio, watching. As the crew prepared for the evening broadcast, her next segment wasn't scheduled until tomorrow, giving her the unusual luxury of observation without immediate pressure to perform. She watched as anchors Michael Murray and Erica Scott reviewed their notes for the upcoming news hour, their familiar patter, a comforting reminder of the routines that structured broadcast journalism. Yet something felt different today, a subtle shift in her perception of these familiar patterns. "Melanie," called a voice behind her. She turned to find Chelsea Johnson, the network's digital content director, approaching with tablet in hand. "Do you have a moment? There's something you should see." They moved to a quiet corner of the hallway, where Chelsea pulled up a compilation of social media responses to the interview. "These aren't just the usual political junkies or partisan accounts," Chelsea explained, scrolling through the feed. "We're seeing engagement from demographics that typically tune out political coverage entirely. Young viewers, politically disengaged. Segments, people who normally change the channel when interview segments come on. They're not only watching but sharing and commenting." Melanie studied the screen, her journalistic instincts temporarily overriding her personal discomfort. "What are they responding to specifically?" "That's the interesting part," Chelsea replied. "It's not the conflict they're highlighting, it's the moments of genuine exchange, particularly when the conversation shifted to substantive policy issues. This clip of the legal aid reform discussion has been viewed over 1 million times already." She handed the tablet to Melanie, who watched as Usha Vance calmly articulated a vision for legal system reform that transcended partisan divides. What struck her wasn't just the content, but the delivery, passionate yet precise, informed yet accessible. "There's something else," Chelsea continued. "The comments show viewers explicitly noting and appreciating the contrast between different interviewing approaches. They're media literate enough to recognize when they're being served substance versus spectacle." As this conversation unfolded, Usha Vance had concluded her phone call and was being escorted from the building by Ashley Turner, a junior production assistant assigned to guide guests through the labyrinthine hallways of the network headquarters. "That was quite an interview, Mrs. Vance," Ashley ventured as they waited for the elevator. Usha smiled warmly. "Thank you, and please, call me Usha." "I'm still in journalism school," Ashley continued, emboldened by the friendly response. They teach us all about adversarial interviewing techniques, about creating moments of tension, but watching today made me wonder if there might be another approach that's just as compelling. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and they stepped inside. As the doors closed, Usha considered the young woman's comment. Journalism at its best isn't about technique, it's about purpose, she said thoughtfully. Are you trying to illuminate or inflame, inform or perform? The methods should serve the mission, not the other way around. Ashley nodded, absorbing the perspective. I've never thought about it quite that way. As the elevator descended, Usha continued. The most effective journalists I've known ask simple, direct questions and then truly listen to the answers. They're more interested in understanding than in proving their own cleverness or creating viral moments. When they reached the lobby, Ashley extended her hand. Thank you, not just for the interview, but for taking the time to talk with me. Usha shook her hand warmly. The future of journalism is in the hands of people like you, Ashley. Choose wisdom over spectacle, and you'll serve your audience well. As Usha departed the building, the ripples from her interview continued to spread. In the main newsroom of National Capital News, the editorial team was holding an impromptu meeting to discuss coverage for the evening broadcast. The Vance interview is generating significant traction, noted Frank Johnson, the executive producer. We should include highlights in tonight's political roundup. Which highlights? Asked Lisa Patterson, the senior political editor. The attempted gotcha moments that didn't land, or the substantive policy discussion that's actually driving engagement? The question hung in the air, forcing a moment of collective reflection. It was Melanie Mitchell, entering the newsroom after her conversation with Chelsea, who broke the silence. The substance, she said, drawing surprised glances from colleagues who hadn't noticed her arrival. Feature the policy discussion. That's what's resonating with viewers. Her recommendation, so contrary to the network's usual emphasis on conflict and confrontation, created a momentary pause in the room. Frank studied her with curiosity, noting the unusual suggestion. Are you sure? He asked. The ratings formula has always prioritized moments of tension. The metrics on this interview suggest otherwise, Melanie replied, her journalistic instincts overriding her pride. Sometimes the audience surprises us. Maybe they're hungry for something different. As the news team debated coverage strategies, Usha Vance's car pulled away from the network building. Her phone buzzed with messages, campaign staff updating, her on the interview's reception, colleagues offering congratulations, friends expressing support. She scanned them briefly before setting the phone aside, gazing out the window at the city streets. The interview hadn't been about personal vindication for her. It had been about demonstrating an alternative approach to public discourse, showing, rather than telling, modeling rather than preaching. Whether it would have any lasting impact remained to be seen, but she had done what she could to inject substance into a system often driven by spectacle. By evening, the interview had become the focal point of discussions across multiple platforms. Political analysts dissected the exchanges. Communication experts highlighted the techniques Usha had employed. Social media users shared their favorite moments. What had begun as an attempted humiliation had transformed into something unexpected, a case study in effective communication and authentic engagement. In her home office later that night, Melanie Mitchell found herself re-watching the interview, studying it not as its participant, but as a student of her craft. 20 years in broadcast journalism had honed her instincts, built her reputation, established her approach. Yet today's exchange had prompted questions she hadn't considered in years. When had confrontation become her default mode rather than a tool selectively employed? When had provoking reaction become more important than eliciting information? When had the performance of journalism overshadowed its purpose? As the clock approached midnight, she opened a new document on her computer and began typing notes for tomorrow's broadcast, ideas for a different approach, questions focused on substance rather than spectacle, strategies for genuine engagement rather than manufactured conflict. Whether this moment of reflection would lead to lasting change remained uncertain. The incentive structures of contemporary media, the audience expectations shaped by years of political theater, the competitive pressures of ratings and engagement metrics, all these forces pushed toward the familiar patterns of confrontational journalism. Yet as Melanie drafted her notes, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a renewed sense of purpose, a reconnection with the fundamental mission that had drawn her to journalism in the first place. Not to perform outrage, but to pursue understanding, not to inflame divisions, but to illuminate complexities. Across town, in the quiet of her own study, Usha Vance was similarly reflective. The day's events had unfolded differently than anticipated, yet the outcome aligned with her deeper goals. Not personal triumph, but substantive engagement. Not winning a verbal sparring match, but modeling a more productive form of public discourse. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new conversations. The campaign would continue its rhythms of speeches and strategy sessions, policy discussions, and public appearances. The media would cycle through its perpetual churn of coverage and commentary. The political landscape would remain divided, contentious, often toxic. But for this moment, in the quiet aftermath of an unexpected exchange, something small but significant had shifted. A different approach had been demonstrated, not through grand pronouncements about changing the tone of politics, but through the simple, powerful act of refusing to participate in its degradation. Sometimes, the most effective response to attempted humiliation isn't defensiveness or counterattack. Sometimes, it's simply the steady insistence on substance over spectacle, on dignity over drama, on conversation over confrontation. Sometimes, the most powerful reality check isn't delivering one, but embodying an alternative that reminds us all of what public discourse could and should be. In studios and newsrooms, in living rooms and on social media, people who had witnessed the exchange carried its lessons forward in ways large and small. A reminder that even in our fractured media landscape, moments of authentic engagement still have the power to break through the noise and touch something essential in our collective desire for connection, understanding, and truth.